live in a few, so I'll put us in the back. What is going on, everybody? My name is Joshua Void. I will be your host, or I'm the host of the Atheist Uprising. And today we're going to have a fantastic conversation with Greg Rogers talking about literally why God created the angels and humans. What was the purpose behind this sense of creation? And I think this is really going to be a great conversation to have, and I'm happy to have Greg back on. But before we continue, I do want to thank our Patreon supporters, Linear and TART, for really helping us do what we love doing, which is producing awesome content for viewers such as yourself. And the other thing that I really want to do is thank everybody who is inside the comment section at this very moment. Thank you, Linear, Wes, and Electro Live for being here. Now, without further ado, I would love to bring on to the show for the second time, Greg Rogers. Greg Rogers, welcome back to the Atheist Uprising. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much for having me again. I'm excited to talk about this.
I'm excited too. I've been really looking forward to this conversation for quite some time. And today I just want to know where your point, or where you stand on the point of creation, because for me, I don't want to talk past you. I want to talk with you on this matter and see where we can to understand each other's points and everything like that. So I would actually throw a question, if you don't mind, and that would be, why did God create the angels and humans? What was the purpose for this?
Right, and I think it's a great question. I've had it posed to me a couple of different ways. One was, why did he create the angels? Why did he create mankind? I've also had it said, okay, why did he create anything? Because if he's a God that has no need, has no want, why in the world would he create anything? In particular, if he's completely fulfilled within himself, it would seem like there's really not even a need on his part to, if he is a creative God, to even express creativity, because he has there's nothing that he would have a need to be able to demonstrate that in any way. He's already fulfilled within himself. So I think the answer with regards to the angels is, you have to hone it down to another question, not just why would he create the angels, but why would he create any being that has a will of its own when he's omniscient and he's perfect in all ways? It kind of seems contradictory, or it's a paradox from the standpoint of, if he truly is omniscient, then he would know that by creating the angels, a third of them he's actually creating, and they're going to end up going to hell. And if he's perfectly compassionate, that doesn't sound like a very compassionate thing to do. So it should take you, and it was a question that was posed to me by other atheists in the past, is why would he create those angels if he knows that a third of them are going to go, and he's going to contradict his own nature if he really is perfectly loving and perfectly compassionate? And exactly. So I think that's really the crux to the question.
So. Right. Now, the one thing that, because I'm still at the place of the birthday party, so I do apologize if there's a lot of background noise in the background. But what I do want to ask is, if we are looking, because the way that you stated that is kind of like God, well, if you don't mind me asking, are you trying to state that the reason why God created the angels and created mankind was to somehow understand himself in a sense? In a
No, it actually comes down to I think the only thing that makes sense as to why God would create the angels, if he is perfectly loving, perfectly compassionate, and knows that a third of them are going to end up going to hell in the long run by even having them created with a will of their own. If he really is truly loving and compassionate, is that he would be forced to do so. He's compelled into the action of creation. And that should send up all kinds of red flags from everyone saying, wait a minute, you just told me that this is a God who's omniscient, omnipotent, all those omni powers, and yet you're saying that he's being forced to do something. That's not God. That means whatever's forcing him is actually God.
right.
Right. And so that is the case unless what's forcing him is coming from within himself.
Right. Or unless he's determined to do so, right? Like if he's determined to create, in a sense, because let's just say an argument that I've heard before from theists is that he wants to create because it's a divine thing, it's a holy thing to do. So henceforth, he can only do things that are holy. And if that is the case, then creation in and of itself is the only thing that he's determined to do because it's the only thing that is holy to do. In a sense,
I've heard that answer. The problem is it's a lot of like a lot of answers that sometimes Christians can give. It's if you present an answer and yet that answer contradicts some other aspect of his perfection, then you can know that either your answer is wrong or it's incomplete. And so let's say he's determined because of his nature, or as you said, that was the holy thing to do. But yet, in doing this holy thing, being perfectly holy in that regard, he's now doing something that's not perfectly compassionate as well. Then you can know that he's violating an aspect of his perfection. In that case, that's the wrong answer. That's not why he's doing it. Does that make sense? Because you just turned a perfectly holy God who's doing it for a perfectly holy reason into one who's willing to violate his perfect compassion and perfect love to uphold his perfect holiness. In that case, he's not actually perfect. You've actually made an imperfect God.
right. But I think because I think the whole entire problem with the way that I think certain theists delve into the question might be because they want something that is perfect. They want something that is holy in order to be that creator aspect, right?
Right.
But at the same time, I think the perfection in and of itself is the problem to the solution. It doesn't necessarily seem to answer the question. It seems to actually open up much more problematic questions to it. If
Oh, no,
this
you're right on. And I think that what you end up finding out as you dig down into it, and don't relegate yourself to an incomplete answer. You challenge an incomplete answer and say, wait a minute, if he's going to violate perfect compassion, wait a minute, what else? There had to be a reason why he would say, wait a minute, I have to go a route that might look that way. There would be an underlying other aspect of perfection that he was having to uphold. And I think what you end up finding out was that, you know how some people say that your greatest strength is your greatest weakness? Have you ever heard people say that?
sometimes
In the case of God, I think his greatest strength, his greatest weakness is that perfection. His perfection is actually his greatest strength, but it's also his greatest weakness. And let me show you why. You have let's say again, you have a perfectly omniscient God, who's perfect in every way, meaning he's perfectly content, he's perfectly compassionate, he's perfectly loving, he's perfectly just, he's perfectly holy, he's perfectly merciful, he's all those things at once. And you have a God that realizes that within the praises of a created being, another being that worships him, he can actually inhabit that praise. Now, wait a minute. We just said he was an omnipresent God, but if that creature is not created in order for him to actually experientially inhabit that praise, that place does not exist for him to be omnipresent in it, because it doesn't exist until that being is actually created to worship. But so he can know omnisciently what it would be like to experience himself in that created presence, that inhabitable praise. But until he actually creates the being and they praise him, he actually can't experience himself in that inhabitable space. And I'll close it just by saying this: what happens to a God who knows that he can have the greatest treasure of all, which is to know himself more deeply? He can experience himself in a place that has never existed before. If he could know himself in that way, and he's the greatest treasure of all, is it possible that he could become discontent if he did not experience that? Not a big problem for us as imperfect beings, but for a perfect being to now experience discontentment, is it possible that discontentment could become imperfection? And what does that mean to a perfect God?
That's a very good question. And I'm sorry, there was a lot of noise, so there was a bit of things that I didn't necessarily hear within.
And if I need to verbalize it again, that's fine, because I know it's kind of, you have to think it through.
It's a bit difficult.
It's a deep thought.
Exactly. And actually, before I even answer, I do want to try to hear that one more time, if you don't mind me asking, because there's, again,
No worries.
everybody's trying to leave, and it's just a lot of creaking and a lot of loudness. So
Yeah.
I really do want to hear what you're trying to say, so I can then rebuttal, or at least maybe even agree in a sense within these.
Think of it this way: if God, if the greatest gift and greatest treasure is to know God, if such a being does exist, and he is the creator of all things, he is perfect in all ways, he is all the things that we think are associated with him, or at least I do as a believer. If he is omni, all these different things, there is no greater treasure than to know him. Is that a possibility for God himself, if he could know himself more deeply, more intimately? If that's the case, then for him to not be able to experience himself, the greatest treasure that there is, in a more intimate and deep manner, would be actually a possibility, but it'd probably be the only thing that could actually cause him to become discontent, because there's nothing that's out there that would be great enough for him to say, I feel compelled to seek that thing, other than more of himself. In that case, what would end up happening is that internal want would actually become for him a need, if by not getting it, it would actually make him imperfectly discontent.
Right. And for me, I would state that it's because I understand where you're coming from with that. It's kind of like you're getting outside information about yourself from the things that you create, and henceforth it kind of gives yourself that purpose in order to say that, okay, maybe I am wholly good in a sense, without necessarily knowing. If I'm understanding that correctly, I might be missing this.
Well, I'm not exactly sure if you'd say that he learned something about himself through us. It's that in the praise and worship, he actually says that he can inhabit that praise and worship. It's at a spiritual level. I don't completely understand it. That's just how he describes it. And so it would be as if there was another room that was next door to you, that had a whole set of other ways that you could go in and actually experience yourself. You could do stuff in there if that door was ever opened. And what God has described is that door can only be opened to God for him to experience himself as he would experience himself in that room if he created us, because that room doesn't exist until we actually are created, if that makes sense.
Interesting. Before I continue on, there's a couple of individuals that have delved in with the comments with their questions. So right here, Linear stated that God would know himself even if he doesn't make humans and angels, since he knows everything already.
Because he's omniscient.
Exactly. Yeah. He would know all experiences without having to lift a finger. And I think that she's right about that. I think Linear is right about that when she states that. Is that, why do I need to create something if I already know myself?
because there's a difference between head knowledge and experiential knowledge. I can say that I know what it means to be in that door. He knows what it's like to be in that room, but he's never been in that room until he goes in that room. So I can know, there's a lot of things that we can know just from a knowledge set. I mean, we can know, well, I mean, it's just any number of things that probably we can about an atom. Let's say, I mean, I'll just use an example of an atom. We can know that electrons are flying around an atom because we can measure that and all that kind of stuff. But no, we have never really gone in and seen that. If you had the opportunity to go and be in an atom and actually see an electron orbiting it, it would be a completely different view than what you may have of seeing what it may look like through experience, through experiments. And I know that's a poor example, but I guess what I'm getting at is I can know the information about it, but until I experience it, I've never not lived it. And he is wanting the opportunity, he to know himself, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, being able to be in a place that doesn't exist and actually experience what that is, not just know what it would be to experience it, but actually to experience it.
Interesting point. But I think the other thing is that if God is something that is omnipresent, for instance, now there's different ideas for omnipresence. Omnipresence can mean that he is within every aspect of the present, in a sense. So every aspect of the present, God's within, but he knows of the future, but he can't be in the future because the future didn't happen yet. But we also have another idea based on omnipresence where it's sort of that God is in every aspect of time, in a sense. So no matter if it's in the future, no matter if it's in the past, and no matter if it's in the present,
he's
God
transcendent.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I think before we even ask that question, we need to really delve into what type of God are we talking about? Are we talking about the God who is of the omnipresent, or are we of the God that is of literally the omnipresent of time in and of itself?
Yeah,
And
I would say it's the latter. I mean, he is transcendent.
Right.
For him, the present, past, present, future, everything as if it is present. He experiences nothing from the standpoint of it's not chronological from his perspective. It all is happening as if it is now.
So in a sense, if that is the case, then he's within a time where humans don't exist. He's within a time that humans do exist. And he's within a time that within the future, they might not or do exist. So he's within all these timelines. And henceforth, I think that is why certain people have a difficulty when we state that God wants to know himself, because he's already delved into this from being in all parts of time before, and henceforth he doesn't technically need to create anything.
I can understand that perspective, but transcendency, even when you say that the future is present, it means that there still is a future that does happen at some point. If it never does happen in the future, then there would be nothing to be transcendent with. So that means that experiential experience actually has to happen at some point. Now, the problem that we face with this is because we as humans think chronologically, and it's really hard for us to think about a God who both is transcendent and chronological. There's a reason why the Bible says that in the fullness of time, certain things happens. I believe that when he's talking about the fullness of time, things happening, that's when the chronological event matches up with his transcendent experience of it was, when you have chronology and transcendency overlapping.
Interesting. I'll jump into that, but before I do, I want to bring in a question also from the comments section.
Yeah.
Why would this perfect thing need or even want worship? So that
a quick answer, I guess, is to say he doesn't need worship. He doesn't want worship, because he has no need or want of anything other than the one want that would be there for a God that is of his nature. He wants more of himself, if that is a possibility. If he could experience more of himself, and you got to remember, when you say experience more of himself, the Christian God is is one God that also exists in three personages. In his oneness, he knows himself as the Elohim, the God that is both as singular and yet plural. He knows everything about himself that he would ever need to know about himself because he is one God. But yet, because he exists in three personages, those three personages, if there could exist in another place that does exist, could actually experience themselves in a relationship in a place if it in a new place if it didn't exist beforehand. And so when God can exist within the praises of a created being, if that created being has not been created yet, there's no place to exist in and to experience himself in yet.
But that's the thing, though. I think that this might take a little bit of a philosophical spin in a sense. But I think
Yes.
when we look at, let's just say, God and any type of being in and of itself, there are things that are called eidexicals.
Mhm.
Now, what those are is that you only know the way that you feel. Nobody else can know the way that you feel but you.
Yes.
And nobody knows what's happening within you but you, in a sense, right? You can
Yes.
speculate, but you don't really know what that thing really feels inside. Only that thing can tell you what it feels. Now, for me, when I look at God, I would feel God being in that same position, having
Mhm.
the same sense of eidexical. It knows what it feels within itself.
Yes.
But I feel that a lot of times that there are certain individuals, no, not individuals, but I think that when people try to understand and try to state that this is what God wants or this is what God does, I have a feeling that we're kind of just like how Kai Nielsen's kind of states it. We're kind of reaching into the dark here, in a sense.
Mm.
Like we're trying to grab the best thing that can possibly equate to perfection, and
Yes.
then bring it as close as we possibly can. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we're actually grabbing onto anything that's tangible, because we are utilizing wordages. And through our phraseology, for instance,
Mhm.
there's a lot of things that have descriptive power, but we
Mhm.
don't really know what that descriptive power is when we talk about God or when we talk about something being
Perfect.
transcendent and
Or
everything,
yeah.
right? So it's
Yeah.
very difficult to really pinpoint what we mean by God being transcendent. We can say above space and time, but if we really try to delve deeper into it, we lose that aspect. We lose that grasp of what that really means. The
Same thing
more
would be said of perfect.
exactly.
I mean, what
And
does it really mean to be perfect? I mean, I think it's interesting that the Bible says, "Be perfect as I am perfect." What he's saying, I believe, is that he's establishing that his own essence is the standard of what perfection is. So unless you're perfectly aligned and completely of the same essence as he is, you're not his version of perfect. And if he's the creator, then his version of perfect is the only perfect that really matters. He's established himself as the standard.
right. But that's the thing, though, right? Is that
Mm-hmm.
where I think there might be issues, right? Is that, or actually, before I delve into that, Electro Live wanted to ask the question. He said, "Is there like the B theory of God in a sense?"
I'm not sure what the
So,
B theory of God is. I've never heard of
well,
that.
it's kind of like the B theory of time, where time in and of itself is everywhere at the same exact time. Like time is relative in a sense, and that's what the B theory is kind of stating. So I
Yeah.
guess what Scott's trying to say, or Electrolyte is trying to say, is that the case for God as well? Is there a B theory of God in a sense, just like how there's a B theory of time?
Um, I guess I'm having a little hard time translating that over for
Okay,
me.
I'll
Yeah.
try. I'll try. So when we look at relativity or Einstein's
Right.
equation, for instance, we end up seeing that time is relative based to, and I'm not a big like I'm not sure what the equations are, so I'm not going to
Right.
delve into it. But with these equations, we can see that the time, or what is stated, is that the past, present, and future are intertwined into one. And henceforth, within philosophy, or also within, it's called the B theory of time. Now, I think what Scott's trying to state is like a block. Oh, that's what you're trying to say, like a block theory. Oh, my apologies. So block theory is more or less kind of like, are you talking about like block universe in a sense where it is constantly ever expanding, but the past and the future are kind of like, or not, the past and the present are kind of intertwined into one? Just so that I can know, so I can explain.
When I think of transcendency, means that he's not bound by time. That means if he was looking at something, if something were to happen in the past, for him, that would still be as if it was a present event. If something was going to happen in the future, it would be as if that had already happened to him. So he would experience all things as if it was now, because time doesn't matter. It's the reason why when you look at the Bible and it says that Christ was crucified before the foundations of the earth were laid, it's because from his perspective, he's already seen. He has to view everything through the solution to the problem. If not, there would never be a time when sin did not exist for him, because chronologically, you would have sin that happened, you'd have the cross that happened, and sin would be paid for, but he would still live the past as if it was the present. So what God has to do is he has to see everything through the solution. That means that God actually sees everything through a risen Jesus. It's the reason why John 3:16, for God so loved the world, he gave his only begotten son. Not just that he gave his son. It's because the begotten son is actually the first fruits of salvation, the firstborn among creation, as the Bible would say. It's that Jesus, from God's perspective, he always sees him as the risen Savior. Because if he doesn't see everything through risen Jesus, he sees everything in his transcendency as being now, which means if he didn't see it through the solution, he'd always have to live with sin.
Right. But I think the issue, right, when we look at sin in and of itself, and when we look at just the reason why God created, because sin started because of the downfall of the angels originally, and then after all, then went to the downfall of man afterwards when they were within the Garden of Eden. And Adam and Eve took the bite of the fruit of knowledge of good and evil. But when we really look at that, when we really see the damnation, and just like how you stated, the damnation of these particular beings through their free will in order to destroy themselves in a sense, and God knowing this, and God kind of creating these beings to be in that kind of way, and not really giving them that option to really to know of, because just like with let's just say scientists, for instance, this is the only idea that I can really think about at the moment, but just like with scientists, for instance, when we truly delve into when somebody is going through an experiment or something like that, or you're a subject of an experiment, let's just say, the thing is that through, or ethically, the scientist or the individual conducting the experiment needs to tell the individuals what they're going through towards a certain extent, and really show that there's not going to be any harm done to those individuals.
Yes.
Now, there can be...
Are you saying that God did not do that?
That is exactly what I'm saying.
What if I told you that he did?
I would like to hear it.
Okay, so you've got an omniscient God who's perfect in every way, and he knows that he can, if he inhabits the praises of a created being who has a free will, meaning they have their own identity and as a free volitional choice can worship him, he can inhabit that, know himself better. He knows that he can't have that without violating his perfect compassion, but if he doesn't go forward with that plan and create those beings, he's going to violate his perfect contentment. He's in a dilemma. God's in a dilemma. He's either going to violate his perfect compassion or he's going to violate his perfect contentment. So the answer is, I go, okay, well then what I will do is that I will offer these people mercy, or these beings mercy. I will just overlook and forgive them when they violate, when they choose to rebel against me. So instead of sending the third of the angels to hell, I'm just going to forgive him outright. Then you run into a problem for God where he's got to be perfect in all ways, right? Is mercy by definition just? I'm not giving that person what they deserve.
But
By definition, I'll just answer the question if you don't mind. By definition, mercy is not just. So now God's in a dilemma. I can violate my perfect compassion, I can violate my perfect contentment, or I can violate my perfect justice. No matter which way I go, if I'm God, I'm stuck. And so the only answer that I think God could give was to ask the being, hey, and tell the being, if we go down this pathway, you will end up going to hell. So here's the solution. I'm giving you an answer. And the answer was, give up your free will until such time as I rectify the situation. That's what you see happen with the angels. If you want to know why Satan rebelled against God, yes, it was about pride, but I think the pride was, why is it that your essence is actually held up as being the standard of perfection? Why can't my essence be the standard of perfection? You made me in your image, meaning I'm like you, but not you. I have my own identity, but I'm perfectly compatible with who you are right now. Why is it that your will, if I choose to go my will in any other way, I end up in a place called hell because I'm outside of what is the perfect standard? And God had said to you, give up your free will, and because if not, you're going to end up there. I'll rectify the situation. Satan said, I'm not going to do that. There's no reason why you're the standard and I'm not the standard.
Right.
That's why he rebelled.
I think the real problem here, and I think you're even touching on the problem in and of itself.
Yes.
That God needs, if God does exist, then God can't be the omnis, in a sense. Even if he allows the beings in and of themselves to have that free will and knows already that, okay, I have let them know that this is the case through the written literature that I have created.
In that case, it would have been verbal. He had verbalized
well at that time, but just like how he knew or whatever, even though that I don't necessarily think that writing a book is the best way in order to espouse your revelation, but still, besides that, I think that God in and of himself realized that there needs to be something that needs to be written down. The problem that I see is that I find that God constantly messes up his plan. In a sense, he creates Adam and Eve, or he creates the angels. Hold on.
I'll let you finish.
Angels.
Go ahead.
The angels rebel.
Yes.
He states that because of their free will, they rebel against him, and henceforth the angels are cast down, not necessarily to hell, but some of them cast down as Nephilim or whatever the situation may be. Different stories from different Christians have.
Yeah, we'll come back to Nephilim because that's a part of the man creation stuff.
Right. Then he creates man, and through man, he creates Adam and Eve. And from there, Adam and Eve also fail, in a sense. And the thing that I start to realize is that Adam and Eve didn't necessarily need to fail, right? If you move the tree away,
it was inevitable for them to fail. It was inevitable.
That's the thing, right? Because if it's inevitable, then the whole entire point of creating them in the first place and creating humanity in order to suffer the way that they do, and even towards this very day, if this deity does exist, now kind of shows me that this omnibenevolence is thrown out the window, in a sense. It's kind of like somebody who looks at...
Unless he's got a plan that takes it all the way to the end. What ends up happening in these discussions is we stop at one point and we say, oh, look, see, that's a problem. And then it's like, okay, but here's the way that God answered that problem. Oh, but here's another problem.
Mm-hmm.
Here's another problem. Here's another problem. You got to remember, in God's omniscience, he understood all those things. The question is he, through taking each of those steps, he is actually delivering to us the message that, see, I've already tried that. It didn't work. I already tried that. It didn't work. I already tried that. It didn't work. It's not because he needed to learn that it wouldn't work. It's so that we wouldn't constantly be looking and saying, hey, wait, when he says there's only one solution, that I am your representative, that I die in your place, and you ask me to be the remedy for you, to be your representative in this whole thing, that we won't constantly keep looking and saying, well, if you'd made me a perfect being and always like you, except that I just wasn't you, then I would have done it the way that you wanted it to be done. I would have lived out your will perfectly, and we would have been hunky-dory. No, I tried that with the angels. I did that with the angels. It doesn't work. I did it with mankind. It doesn't work.
But yeah. I think the one thing is that, and again, we kind of need to delve into a little bit of philosophy in a sense, is that when people say that you need second order evils in order to create first order goods, in a sense. So towards a certain extent, you need somebody to do evil in order for another individual to do something good in order to benefit, or in order to kind of step outside of their how can I say, comfort zone, and kind of be the best person that they can possibly be, because they're the second order evils. I think that in and of itself, if we really look at, let's just say, we can look at a template of everything that could possibly happen, and we can say, okay, well, we don't need genocide, but you can learn in a different way. Just like, for instance, with sports. Sports is one of the greatest ways in order to learn the sense of companionship, in a sense, where you yourself can learn how to actually work together as a unit in order to achieve a goal. That if you go by yourself and work with pride, that you're not necessarily going to actually win any particular game. These are things that can help you actually understanding and comprehend how to be a good individual without the need of any second order evils, and without the need of anybody actually being hurt within the process, or the need of death, in a sense. But for me, when I look at God's plan, for instance, God, even though you state that he might know, right, that he might know already that these things were going to happen, the problem is that allowing those things to happen and stating that it is a being's fault. Because remember, even with Adam and Eve, for instance, they never had that bite of the fruit of knowledge of good and evil. So they were kind of like adolescents, in a sense, like children within the garden that were meant to name different things and to live their lives out and to prosper and procreate the human race, in a sense, or the holy beings. And when we really look at the outcome here, it really seems that God didn't look outside of the box. He kind of looked at the easiest way to do things and said, this is the way that we're going to do it.
See, I think that you're I'm trying to think of how to say this right. I think you're living in what you're describing is a really human construct of how this looks. And unfortunately, I think it's actually the construct that maybe, because of the way that the church is presented, what's going on at times, I think it's gotten away from really what the Bible is saying about it. I hate to say that. This is not about good and evil. There's no secondary goods and primary whatever, all that stuff. That doesn't matter. What matters is if you have a being that is perfect, and he creates anything for any reason. Let's say he created for the reason I said, to worship him, because he knows he can inhabit their praise. That keeps him from becoming imperfectly discontent. The only way that something can worship him is for it to be, one, its own individual. If not, it's self-worship. That does no good for God. It's another being. So it has to be its own individual. And if you're going to be your own individual, you have to have your own will. By definition, if you have your own will, it means you don't have his will perfectly. You can be compatible with his will, but you don't have his will. As soon as it means, inevitably, if he gives you your own will, eventually there will be a time when you choose something that is different. Notice I didn't say good or bad or right or wrong. All it has to be is different for it not to be perfect. You could choose something that is absolutely good, but if it's not perfect, you now have made yourself incompatible with that which is imperfect. The problem that God ran into is that he understood that it was either he becomes imperfect or he creates us and we become imperfect and suffer the consequences of that. But he knew he could formulate a solution that would fix the problem of what would happen to us. So the primary problem to fix was his discontentment to begin with. That meant create us and then deal with the problem that happened with us.
Okay. And that's actually a pretty good way of putting it. So it's not even towards the extent of second order evils creating first order goods. And towards a certain extent, you're even stating that even if you are putting forth first order goods, if you do not have God within your heart, then those first order goods just don't mean anything whatsoever. They're incompatible with perfection in and of itself. And henceforth, you will be separated from God in and of itself rather than equated into it, even if you are good.
That's right.
Okay.
So and that's why when you hear a Christian say, hey, none of us are good. Don't you understand that? None of us are good. They're not saying that in a human sense we aren't good. We're all capable of loving other people and all that. It's that if it's not perfectly aligned with what his goodness, then it might as well be as dark as the darkest dark, because perfection is uncompromising. You can't have perfection and have any degree of taintedness to it.
But that's the number one thing, though, right? Is that then after we need to look at the model of perfection in and of itself. Because for me, when we look at certain biblical scriptures, and just like how I had the conversation yesterday with Cafe, for instance, and he was talking about the idea that what the mystic goes through in a sense, and how the mystic reaches and it kind of not ascends, but kind of transcends the self and kind of reaches into that extent of godly, no, I shouldn't say godlyhood, but understands that idea of perfection towards a certain extent, or that absolute, or that transcendental knowledge in a sense. But at the same time, the one thing that always gets to me is that we need to look at what the actual literature states. And if the literature is stating things that is beneficial for all, then I would, and has certain knowledges that there was no way for us to know, for instance, that are for that time, and then brought into the future, and we're kind of like, wow, they knew all this stuff. But I think the problem is that when we really look at the punishments bestowed upon individuals, right? Like, for instance, Adam and Eve eat from the apple, and now Eve is meant to bear children and suffer from that, and Adam is meant to toil the ground and everything like that until he dies. Both of them are forced to do this. And when we really look at these ideas, in a sense, and even towards the extent of genocide, for instance, within the Bible, we now can slowly but surely start to see that, okay, perfection isn't as perfect as we think it is, because there are different ways in order to go through things and not necessarily even change the person's mind. Just the way that your own inhabitants, right, engage with another group of individuals can change those individuals' minds. Does it take longer? Yes. But can it sure happen? Absolutely. And we see it with the growth of Christianity. We see it with the growth of Islam. You just need time, and you have the expansion. You have your ideas start to grow, in a sense.
Do you think Islam in its earliest form had more or less followers that lived? Let's just say that Islam began as a love-based form of relating to one another.
Okay.
Do we see more or less of a percentage of what I would say would be of hate within Islam now, or when it first started? Do you think it's gotten better or worse as being a love-based? And I can say the same thing for Christianity. Do we see more or less purity of love now than we did in its very beginnings.
Well, again, I think that we need to look at the idea of love, but I'll answer your question first. And
Yeah.
I think that Islam in the beginning, in its very foundations, and if we look at the Prophet Muhammad and what he actually did in the beginning when he was within Mecca, or was it Medina? I forget and he's first started his his teachings or his preachings
Yes.
based on the revelations that he got from the angel itself. What we slowly but surely start to see is that in the beginning, he did try that aspect of tolerance. He did try that aspect of bringing in individuals and really try to connect with people. And it's actually looked at as the more shamanistic in its, or maybe not shamanistic. I shouldn't say shamanistic, but I guess you can say like a more Sufist type look at Islam. But after, when Muhammad realized that he didn't really gain followers from that, he gained more followers from becoming. And yes, don't get me wrong, was he persecuted? Absolutely.
Do we see more violent sects now than we did before, or violence between sects now?
Actually, I think you see the same exact thing. You see the violent. The only reason why the violence against sex is more visible at this very moment, or seems visible at this very moment, is because of the news channels and news agencies putting that front and center. Now, I think if you would go back to Jesus's time, for instance, because even Jesus was Jewish prior to being any type of Christian.
I would say Christianity is a Jewish sect.
I would agree. I would completely agree with you. But that's the whole entire thing. What was Jesus, or what was Jesus trying to achieve? If we're looking at him being as the Son of God, if we look at him being as God, if we look at him being as a prophet, or if we look at him being as a sage, for instance, what was his number one thing that he was trying to do? He was trying to create disturbances within an already settled ideology within I was about to say Hinduism, within
Judaism.
Judaism, thank you.
What if I told you that he wasn't trying to create disturbances? What he was trying to do was create a pathway to save.
I would say that could be the case, but through that pathway to save, he himself created those disturbances willingly.
I would say he was a disturbance. He was a disturbance.
Exactly.
Himself.
And I think that from that point, and just like with any other disturbances, and I had this, again, conversation yesterday with Cafe, if you are somebody who only preaches and stuff like that, there was a lot of preachers during the time of Jesus who was preaching the end of times, that they were the Messiah in and of themselves, and so on and so forth.
Absolutely.
And what ended up, or what seemed to happen in a sense, was that Jesus in and of himself wasn't necessarily, I don't want to say he wasn't the biggest, because we don't necessarily know at that time, but we only know that he had 12, or not know, but supposedly he had 12 disciples.
Those were his closest. Yeah. He had other disciples, but yeah.
Right. But the only time where we actually see Christianity start to grow is through the Pauline writings, for instance, in the Pauline literature. And that's where we actually start seeing Christianity come from this small sect, or small Judaistic sect, into now this ever-growing religion, because of the Pauline writings and because of how Paul perceived what Christ wanted, in a sense.
I don't know if I would say it was because of Pauline. I think Pauline's writings are the capture of one of the apostles that went out and did something. His captures the most of the move that went out into Greece and into Rome. But I mean, like Thomas, he went all the way supposedly into India. So it spread not just because of Paul, it spread because Peter went out. It spread out because all of the 12 disciples went out and went somewhere.
They all went somewhere.
But we only capture and only see mostly Peter and Paul.
Right. But I mean, if we really look, Paul wasn't a disciple, though. He was
That's right.
only
Not until
after.
after Acts.
Exactly.
Yes.
And it was only once he was persecuting Christians that he ended up having this revelation on his road to, I believe it was the road
Damascus.
to Damascus.
Yes.
And from that, he had the revelation and saw Jesus and felt this overwhelming force over him that then brought him to want to be Christian now and
Right.
to spread Christianity in and of itself. And
Right.
that's the number one thing that I focus on. And the reason why I focus on Pauline literatures is not because the other disciples didn't go out, it's because Paul stayed within the actual general region within the Roman Empire in order to create that base foundation of what we now see as Catholicism. And let alone, we can
Right.
say that he kind of birthed, in a sense, orthodoxy as well. But still, this is an individual who had a lot of weight within Christianity. He had a lot of weight within how Christianity is even looked at today, in a sense. And we do use the Gospels, and I'm not saying
Right.
the Gospels are for naught, but after the Gospels, we see a lot of Pauline literature which is in there and delved into that and showing Christians what are the right ways of doing things and what are the wrong ways of doing things, in a sense.
Right.
And that's where Christians, or at least the modern Christians, take a lot of their information from. Women should not be allowed to speak within the church or whatever. They are not allowed
Right.
to become priests and stuff like that. They are not
I mean,
allowed.
there's there's a lot of rabbit trails we can chase that are separate from, I think, the original discussion point, which
Yeah,
was why
which
did
is
God
why he
create the
created.
angels and why did he create man?
Yeah,
I mean, I could say, hey, look, if you look at Paul, you see that there's like 6 different times when he actually put up women as being the leaders in different areas, as opposed to. So it wasn't that Paul was saying, or at least I think it's obvious that Paul was not saying, hey, women can't be preachers, because he actually used women to be preachers and heads of different places. I think he was talking to Timothy and some of the younger pastors at the time and saying, in your churches, you are having this male-female rivalry, this conflict that's happening. I don't want you to get involved in that conflict. So in your churches, I want you just to say there's not going to be a woman who's going to be in a head position, because I need you to focus on this other stuff. If anyone's going to fight that battle, it's going to be when I show up and I'll place a woman over the head. If there's going to be a time when a woman's over the head, I'll be the one that does that battle, not you, Timothy. And
that
so
could be because
I
it's
think that's
true.
probably what
That could
happened.
be the case. But again, just like how you stated, we went down the rabbit
A
trail.
rabbit trail.
Yeah, exactly. Let's
Let
jump back.
me see if I can help. Let me see if I can just lay out again what I think is happening in the creation of the angels and man.
Please, yes.
And because what ends up happening is we'll end up chasing a bunch of different questions around, and you'll never actually hear what I thought was the reason for it.
Good point. Good point. So let's delve into that.
Okay, so remember, I've said that I think God was doing it because a want that he had of knowing himself, experiencing himself more. Not, I shouldn't say knowing, because omniscience means that he knows it. Experientially knowing himself better was the reason why he created something that could worship him. And if he needs this thing to happen, so with every being that's there, he would experience himself in a different way, because it's a different type of worship that everyone gives. He's going to have either two different things that happen. Either he creates a being that is eternal in nature that can eternally worship him, or he creates beings that are finite in nature that have a mechanism that allows them to reproduce themselves infinitely to be able to worship him. So there's 2 different mechanisms. One is the angels, a being that is eternal in nature, a spirit being that never dies and therefore can always worship him, or a man who can die, who's finite, but because they can be fruitful and multiply, they can reproduce themselves. Unlike the angels, they can always be reproducing themselves. The problem I think that we face, or that God faced, is with the angels. If it's a spirit being, as soon as they inevitably choose to do something other than his will, they become eternal. There's only one death that they can face. It's an eternal death. because they're spirit beings, they will eternally be separated from him and experience that. That would be hell. And so he would, but yet that is a mechanism by which he can gain worship. It's probably the one that lasts the longest before something rebels against him. Think of it as being a battery. All of us are basically batteries that fulfill the role of worshiping him, but eventually we run out of power. We die. And normally we would think we would discard a battery as if it's nothing, but God recognizes that he gave us individuality and a will. So we are something different than just something to be discarded without thought. We are an individual that will experience death and what it means to be separated from him. So he says, wait a minute, with the angels, we can go this far, but eventually I'm going to have to ask you to give up your will. Because if you don't give up your will, you will rebel against me and you will face death. That's why he created the angels first, because they would go the farthest, the longest without him having to do something, without there being a death that would be experienced by a being. Then he goes the route of mankind, and he puts in place a mechanism where they will die, but they won't have hell. They will just go away, dust to dust. The problem is that it's easy for an angel like Satan who says, wait a minute, my judgment is eternal separation from you. They just go away. That's not just. So God creates another being after mankind. Adam's not the first man. So Adam is a man that's created after the first men and women that were created to serve as that battery.
Okay.
And he creates them and he puts them in a situation where there's only one thing that he could do wrong. And it's not even a want. It's a need. It's a want. Don't eat of this fruit and you'll be fine. You can serve as that battery. And I'll only look at you when I'm judging everyone else as to whether or not they are in right standing with me.
But I think that in lies the issue, though, right? Because just like how we spoke last show, for instance, when we look at God and his first initial creation of the angels and everything like that, you stated that God's want of something became a need, and the reason why he needed it was because he didn't want to become imperfect within
himself, because he would face his own hell, because he now have to live with himself as being imperfect.
Absolutely.
The one thing he can't stand.
Right. But the thing is that God has lived with himself in that state for who knows how long, if he did exist. And henceforth, it kind of shows to me, at least, that if this deity is, let's just say, an infinite
transcendent being,
or a transcendent being, then all of a sudden there comes a problem to that, in my opinion, because he's content throughout the majority of his existence, and then that one instance he has a thought, let's just say, or he has a revelation of his own. And then all of a sudden it's like, oh, well, now I'm going to create the angels. And
remember what I said, that God sees all things through the solution to the problem. He from all time has always seen all of this through Jesus as the risen Savior. That's why he sent his only begotten son, not his only son. He always has seen. And that means even as he was back in the very beginning, when he said, I'm going to create the angels because if I can inhabit their praise, the only reason why he could see that is because he was already looking through the solution of the risen Jesus to see that he would have this thing that he could experience.
Okay. But I think there lies an issue also, because it's kind of like, if he already knew all this through the risen Jesus, right? Like, let's just say that
why did he have to create anything at all? Because he could have already experienced it through the solution.
Well, that's
transcendency. Because transcendency still has chronology to it. Just because you can know the future and experience the future as if it is now, it does mean that future will eventually exist.
Right. But the
to
thing
have been
is
able to
that,
know it from all time.
right. But the thing is that if God already had this knowledge within his mind, let's just say,
Yes.
then the problem there lies again the duration of time that this wasn't put forward. The duration, and that's why I think when I heard, I believe it was one of the Muslims that we used to speak to on Facebook Messenger, and he stated that God needs to create because it's divine in a sense. That, even though I don't agree with that,
Yeah,
makes
I don't
much
agree with
more
him either.
sense because he is constantly creating, and each one of those creations that he created can have a story, which then interwoves itself into other aspects of other universes of those kind of creations. It kind of sounds weird, but it makes sense. But when we're talking about a single universe, and throughout the entirety of his past, in a sense, there was no need to do this. He had this in his head, but he had no possible reference to it until the specific time of 13.5 billion years. And then all of a sudden it was just like, now let's create this process.
Just
And
remember, 13.5 billion years for him is not the extent of eternity.
oh no, but that's what I'm saying.
Okay.
Apply
Yeah.
that into
Yeah.
as far as you can in the past, and it
Yes.
doesn't necessarily make sense because it's just like if we really looked at if he was already at the beginning and at the end of our timeline, then the universe in and of itself, towards a certain extent, would be him. Right? Because there
The
would be
universe
no
wouldn't be
way.
him.
Exactly.
Because universe is time, space, and matter, and he transcends time, space, and matter.
No, but what I mean is that the universe and him would have existed at the same time because he would have already had that thought in his head from the very beginning. So
Yes.
13.5 billion years.
But that's what he tells us in the Bible, is that he did have that thought from the beginning of time.
Right, but that's what I mean though. So time beginning and God's idea
Yeah.
of that start at the same time. And henceforth, there was no prior to the universe with God because God already had that thought in his head. And if he only acted on it some, I don't know, trillion, billion, gazillion years or Google tillion years into the future, for instance, when he was within the void itself, doesn't make any sense if you have that idea within your head. You would automatically start it if you already had the idea.
Well, but from his perspective, he before the foundations of the earth were laid, before anything was ever created, before there was a time, space, and matter, Christ was already crucified, and he was already risen.
Right.
It has
Meaning,
always been that way.
yeah, meaning that even the time in and of itself would have commenced at that point. So as soon as God had that idea, as soon as God had that original, and that's why I think that we're
The
running
idea was always there, though. Is
right,
that
but that's
yeah?
what I mean though, right? When we're looking at the time of the universe, the thing that would make the most sense or whatever is that when God had that thought started 13.5 billion years ago. That means that God existed, right, 13.5 billion years ago. But hence, if there's no other multiverse theory or anything like that within this story, he himself exists only 13.5 billion years ago.
I think it would exist from all eternity.
But
The
that wouldn't
question
make
is,
sense.
what does the 13.5 million years ago mark for us? What's
Well,
the
the
creation of the
creation of all
universe?
matter. Exactly. But my question
Where do you
is
stick? Where do you stick if you have an angel or set of angels that rebel against you, and you decide that you are going to not send them to hell immediately, but rather going to essentially answer an accusation that they give, and you're an omnipresent God? Where do you stick something if you're omnipresent in the heavens that exist as they are then? If you're not, where do you stick them? You're everywhere.
mm-hmm.
You create another level of heaven to stick him in.
Right. But
This universe, I think, is another level of heaven that
which makes
God created so that he could stick Satan here.
Okay.
until such time as he answers the accusation.
Right. But the thing that I'm not necessarily getting, and maybe I'm
Mhm.
not asking the question properly enough.
Right.
I think.
Or I could not be understanding.
Oh no.
So
Either.
it could be me completely.
Oh no. But at
Justin,
the
we're
same
both
time.
humans. We're both humans here.
Right.
So
Exactly.
and there will be
So
some, there may come a point that we just go, we don't get it.
right. It's true. It's true. But
Yeah.
from the point that I'm trying to state is that if we're looking at God has always had this idea in his head from the very beginning, right?
Yes.
But at the same time, we know that he only put forward his plan some 13.5 billion years ago, right? Henceforth,
It happened before then because the rebellion happened before 13.5 billion years ago.
okay.
So he would have created the angels before 13.5 billion years ago.
Interesting. Okay. So we can now jump onto that and say that God in and of himself, for instance, had this idea of creating. I realize where we're missing. The idea of creation and God are simultaneous. So as soon as God exists, there would already be a sense of creation, right? Because already he is
I'll
active.
contemplate that.
Pardon?
I said, I'll contemplate that. Let me think
Right.
about that while you're talking.
Right. Because from that point, it would make sense that if he always had these thoughts in his head, and for him not to act on those thoughts until, let's just say, he created the angels, and how much time he existed prior to the angels actually being created or whatever, it doesn't necessarily make any sense because he already had the idea in his head. And henceforth, if he already had the idea in his head, creation and God are simultaneous within their existence.
I don't think they'd be simultaneous because you would have to have the God to have the thought.
Right, but
so the God would happen before the thought.
Right, but the question is that you stated that the thought was. Hold on, let me try to formulate this.
You're saying, because I did say earlier that the thought was always there. And I think that's where you're drawing that from. And that's because God, and the way I reason to that is if he's truly transcendent, then there's no moment that he doesn't experience as a moment in the present. Even the first moment, if there was a first moment. I think the difference is, though, when you have truly transcendency, you go outside of any moment. God would transcend all moments. Even the first moment when he would have a thought, he would be beyond even that. So, because that's what true transcendency would be, is that there's not even a past, present, and a future. There is only is.
Exactly.
So, and I think you would even transcend is if you have true transcendency. I don't even know how to describe what it would be to transcend is.
Right.
I don't have the language for that.
But I think that if we're saying that the being already has ultimate knowledge in and of itself, as soon as God would exist, right?
Which he always did.
Exactly. Then that thought would happen. Let's just say if it didn't.
For him, it would be as if it was then.
Exactly. And henceforth, creation and God would be in tandem.
I mean, I guess I'd have to contemplate that a lot more. I'm not saying that I disagree with it. I'm trying to understand the ramifications of that because it's not a thought that I've thought about before, just being honest.
No, it's cool.
Which is good. I appreciate that because what that does is causes me to say, okay, wait, God, there's an aspect of that I don't get. And quite frankly, if there ever comes a point where there's not an aspect of God that I don't get, then I might as well stop worshiping that God because he's not really that. That means he's not beyond my ability to think.
Right.
And in which case I might as well be God.
Right, exactly. And I think because that's the one thing that I never want to try to force on a believer is
Mhm.
is a type of idea that is like, oh, I want to just crush through you and everything like that. That's not the thought. The thought
No,
is
to
that
me,
I'm
this is
trying,
great. I
like the
love
thought
this.
that that's awesome. The thought that I'm trying to instill at least is that could the deity in and of itself be something that we ourselves manufacture within our own minds? And if we ourselves manufacture this deity within our own minds, then we obviously want to give it qualities that we do not have and everything like that, because it itself is supposed to transcend what we look at in a world of material, in a world of slaughter, of famine and everything. And we want to have something that's out there. We want to have something that is better than the place that we have here. And we create, at least in my perspective, we create this realm of perfection because it's kind of like something to strive for. But I think at the same time, it's something that we strive for, but through the words of perfection, we are never really able to get there, right? So we
I mean,
always
I
feel that
agree. We never get there. I agree
exactly,
that, yeah. So I
exactly,
guess, and I think where you end up then in that conversation is either there is a God that's outside of me, or I'm my own God.
exactly. Or you, but not only just
And
that,
then, but then you have to, and here there's two different places you can go with that.
of course,
Um, if you go the realm of then I'm my own God, then um, I become the standard for what is perfection. Then
I don't necessarily see it in that particular way, right? Because let's just say that God is something that we make up within our minds, right? It's not that you become the standard or you become the sense of God. The thing is that it's the drive that is within you to create something that is better than what is here now.
okay,
So it's
but
not
then but that
necessarily,
make but now you've moved again. Now, but Adolf Hitler was going after what he saw as his version of perfection.
oh, you're absolutely correct. But the difference between Adolf Hitler is that he went through his own ideas of perfection, right?
Yeah.
Through putting people into suffering. And there's other individuals that try to bring forth something that is better. And that's why whenever you look at philosophy, for instance, and we ask those
Yeah.
ethical questions and those moral questions, it is us not necessarily grasping with perfection. It's us grasping with what is going to make something better tomorrow, right? How can we make something beneficial for our children's generation, in a sense? So at least,
Yeah.
sorry, go ahead.
No, well, and that's where I would say, like, I know some Christians say that like an atheist is incapable of really doing anything that is morally good or whatever,
Mm,
or it sounds like they sometimes come across as that. No, any person can do something that is good and beneficial to
of
other people,
course.
regardless of what your belief system is.
Absolutely.
And so the question is then, um, is there a standard of perfection to which we are held that's outside of ourselves, or is there not? And are there ramifications for whether or not we uphold that level of perfection? And
I couldn't have said it any better.
yeah, and I think that's what, and maybe that's a place where, because man, we're going in this society down a road where it seems like, hey, look, if you disagree with me on this stuff, then you're someone to destroy, or tend to demonize
Mm,
other viewpoints,
absolutely.
and I think it's a thing that we need to be really careful of.
Oh,
Uh, Yeah, and quite frankly, in America, you're seeing it going down a path where probably there will come a point where Christianity gets outlawed. It would be my best bet.
I wouldn't necessarily say that. I think that Christianity is only going through more what is called ideological morphings, in a sense. If we look at the United States in and of itself, it's still a majority religious country. or whatever. Yes, there are
Yeah,
individuals.
religious. You said, yeah, because if you're a say Christian country, I'd be like, okay, wait a minute.
No, no, no.
I don't think we're majority Christian anymore. Yeah,
No, but what I would say is it's still a majority of religious nation, and I
yeah. You're talking
don't
about it being theistic
exactly,
or
and
some
I
kind
don't
of, yeah,
see that that is going to change anytime soon. And I think
yeah,
that when we really delve into the crux of the matter, I think the reality that we're seeing is this left versus right type thing, you know. But
right,
in the end, the truth of the matter is that we need to try to ask ourselves the hard questions in
hmm,
order for us to think about the reality that we're delved into, but not only just that, but even the individuals who we encounter daily. And what are our thought processes when we encounter those individuals? Do we need to be people who are rude, mean, and belligerent? Or could we have fruitful discussions that can change individuals' minds without the need of any force, without the need of any violence, without the need of any outlawing, in a sense?
right,
And I believe that we can reach that without having any type of external perfection or without a government wanting to outlaw something such as Christianity or any other religion which is out there. And I
right.
think that we
Well,
can do that.
ultimately, truth should stand up to scrutiny. Yeah,
I couldn't say it any better.
yeah.
Exactly.
And if it can, then then in the end, truth should be the thing that wins out.
I
So
completely agree.
yeah, yeah. So
Greg, I really want to thank you for coming on the show.
you bet.
We'll reach
Appreciate the
the.
discussion.
I really do too, and I'm sorry for how long it took. It's just everything was
No worries.
all over the place. But again, I loved having this discussion. I love having you on because you're fair. That's the thing. You're not somebody who wants to just come down and just no, you atheists are wrong or whatever. But you want to hear the other person's point, and vice versa. And that's the whole entire reason why I wanted to create this channel in the first place. Hear other individuals' points, but also give pushback so that it's not just a yes, yes, yes type thing. And
None of us grow if all we do is just say yes, yes, yes.
exactly. And
So
henceforth, I really do want to thank you for coming on. It's always been a pleasure. It's always been an honor having you.
thank
And
you.
thank you. Is there anything that you want to say before we?
I guess the only thing I would say, and I think I've shown you this before. Let me see if I can
Oh,
show it.
right there. Yeah.
Yeah, this is when I expressed what I expressed in terms of the creation of the angels, and I wrote this book. It's a fictional story, so just know that. But it's a
Okay.
fictional story, kind of like the Screw Tape Letters, where it's meant to present a theological premise.
Okay.
So the only reason why I say it's fictional is because it's a storyline that allows you to see what I'm talking about rather than me just giving you a treatise.
Interesting.
And so it goes through the aspect of why would an omniscient God create anything that has a will of its own
Hmm.
when he knows that that thing's going to rebel against him, starting with the angels, and it walks you through that. So
Interesting.
if you're interested in kind of at least understanding that, maybe, and you're like, I don't know if Greg explained it in a way that I understood it, and you want to maybe understand those thoughts a little bit more deeply, and we can talk about it again later.
Of course.
This is a good book to go get, and it will probably help you kind of understand at least where my mind is on that. And
Absolutely.
may not agree or with it and all that, but that's not the point. The point is
No.
here's a different set of ideas that you can mull
Exactly.
over. Yeah, and
No.
it's available on Amazon.
Thank you. Thank
Thank
you.
you. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. And also, I do want to thank everybody in the comments section tonight. Wes, thank you, Electro Live. Thank you, Linear. And thank you, oh my, KCA Randy. And everybody else who was on the show tonight or in the comments section. Great questions, fantastic back and forth. Thank you so much. And now, if you like the content, please smack that like and subscribe button. And the other thing that I want to say is we now have a Discord open, and the link is at the bottom. So if you want to come in and be part of our Discord, please do. And as for now, I would like to say, have a great night, and I will see you next weekend on the Atheist Uprising.